So I'm Karen. I get to be part of a national coalition called Farmers for Climate Solutions. We're a pretty new group. Amanda and Stuart had amazing advice as to how to organize, so I've actually been reflecting on what they've said so far, thinking, hey, we could learn from that. But today, really, I'm just going to share kind of our experience to date, kind of what we've been up to, and some of the kind of considerations we've had and how we've organized. So we are a national, nonpartisan, farmer-led coalition advancing policy and field programming to support farmers in the face of climate change. We started in 2020 with the NFU being one of our lead founding members. We were 6 members at the outset, representing a relatively small group of farmers across the country, and now we represent over 20,000 farmers from coast to coast, different scales, types, regions of production. So here's our complete list of members to date. We've actually done no work so far in recruiting specific members. These are all groups who have felt like their mission on climate change aligns well with our national coalition and have approached us to join. So I'll just give you a bit of context. I mean, probably all of this is quite familiar to all of you in the room, but you know, why climate change really? So, I mean, first of all, farmers are on the front lines of climate change. This is one of the farmers we work with at Farmers for Climate Solutions in one of his fields in Saskatchewan during one of the recent droughts. Of course, impacts of climate change are really severe in our sector, and it's not a stretch to say we're on the front lines of climate change. Yet, while this requires a lot of attention, adapting to climate change and supporting farmers in the face of it, what we focus on is mitigation. Focusing on mitigation is a really, really polarizing issue, actually. So here's just a few maps of Canada, and we could have done something different for different regions of Canada. But ultimately, you know, this one I think tells an interesting story where, you know, the regions on the right, so the red map, the mostly red map, shows where climate impacts are going to be most severe in Canada, whereas the map on the right shows perceptions of climate change. And the lighter green, so the darker the red on the left means the higher the impact from climate change. The lighter the green on the right means the lower perception, that the lower percentage of people who think that climate change exists and is caused by humans and is a problem we need to deal with. So you can see in the areas we've circled for the purpose of this particular conversation, there is some dissonance between where we feel the largest impacts and where we actually believe there's a problem that needs addressing. So when we think about emissions across Canada, of course, agriculture doesn't dominate the emissions portfolio in Canada. It represents about 10% of Canadian emissions overall, but it's a problematic picture. So what I'm showing here is a map of the provinces where you see in different colors the emission sources. So on-farm fuel use, livestock, crops, and soil. Carbon being green as in sequestration. What you see in this map is that emissions are differentially divided across the country, but that in a general sense, if you add up the blue and subtract the green arrows, those big arrows at the top, what you realize is that from 2005 to 2021, emissions in our sector have increased by 8 megatons. So really actually quite significantly based on the total proportion of emissions in our sector. So despite how polarizing this issue is in our sector, there's something that needs to get done to reduce emissions. So Farmers for Climate Solutions came to be in around 2020 thinking that, you know, those initial groups that we represented were already doing amazing work on climate. But we thought that maybe there was a way in which if we came together to increase the impact of our voice, we could improve sort of the policy landscape and the field programming landscape for farmers in the face of climate change. So what you see on your screen here is kind of where we're at and where we think we're going, which I think is kind of the last piece of context to frame what I'm going to say. So today, 2021-ish today, current emissions are around 50 for our sector. There's a chance that with existing policies in place that are supporting farmers, we might get to that second green dot, so that lower green dot, close-ish to 36, 37 megatons or so. So I'm not saying that we got the path to 2030 figured out. There's still a lot of work to do, but there's potential that we're moving in the right direction. But then when you look to projections for 2050, they're pretty horrendous. So I'm sure most people in the room know Canada has committed to net zero by 2050. So netting out on emissions to zero by 2050, which means that all sectors need to work towards this. However, the only projections that exist for our sector show that there's a chance that our emissions might even double from what they are today by 2050, or they could kind of remain constant. So in either case, not a good news scenario for farmers when we get to 2035, 2040, for sure any sector that has increasing emissions is going to have a massive target on their back. So what Farmers for Climate Solutions is trying to do is to organize to create better public policies that support farmers to reduce emissions, and ideally more field programming across Canada so that more farmers can adopt lower emission, higher resilient ag practices. Okay, context. So what we've done so far since 2020. So when we first started, there was no federal mandate on climate change in agriculture. And that's despite everything I just said. So if there's no federal mandate on climate change, it means that the federal minister doesn't actually have a responsibility to support agriculture, to reduce emissions, or to build resilience. That's a massive problem because for Farmers for Climate Solutions, we wanted to advocate for policy change. And if the minister thinks it's outside of her jurisdiction or outside of her responsibility to the Prime Minister, she's never going to act. So we worked first on changing the mandate, and that landed. So we proposed, as a coalition, we proposed this wording, and it landed directly in a new letter to the minister, a new mandate to the minister in 2021. So that opened the door. So we were like, okay, cool. Now how do we recommend some policy ideas that can get this minister to implement immediately on her mandate? We pulled together a group of folks. Darren Qualman was one of the leaders at the table on behalf of the NFU, and we came up with kind of our first major set of policy recommendations. What you're looking at on this screen, you're going to think, well, this is kind of incomplete. Like, isn't there a lot more we need to do on climate change? Like, 100%. But part of our strategy on organizing was actually like, let's start with the lowest hanging fruit. Let's not ask for the world. Let's start with what we think could be reasonable to try to build some momentum in our sector. Again, a super polarizing issue in which most other groups in the sector were saying, don't do anything, don't do anything. So we wanted to start with sort of an achievable request. And what we did was what you see on the screen. We pulled together farmer leaders with scientists, so climate scientists, some social scientists, as well as agricultural economists. What we were able to do was identify a very short list of practices that we know Canadian farmers are already adopting on their farms that are leading to lower emissions, and we were able to quantify. So we paired these like on-the-farm lived experiences of these practices working on farms with quantification of emission reduction potential and what we call abatement costs. So how much does it cost to reduce those emissions? To come up with a total request of $300 million. This landed. So this became what you now know as the On-Farm Climate Action Fund and a few other related climate programs that affect our sector. So there's one on clean technology, and there's an Environment and Climate Change Canada program on wetlands and trees. So in total, they invested $270 million out of a $300 million request, focusing on 5 of our 6 proposals. From there, they've expanded the program, and the federal government claims that this has now led to a $1.5 billion investment of new public funds to support farmers. Okay, I'll skip that. Finally, before I get on to kind of maybe some considerations that we've had in mind to get to this place, is that we also did something similar, but across political lines. So we worked on the provincial federal framework, so the major policy that guides all of our programming in agriculture, and tried to get some good climate priorities in there. I won't get into the details, but some of those landed. So essentially where we're now at is a place where we have some federal leadership on climate programming and agriculture to better support farmers, and now we even have commitments to FedProv territorial programs across the country. So those aren't really rolled out yet. We don't really know what they're going to look like, but there's at least a bit of momentum in the right direction. I'm going to actually skip this for time and talk more about kind of factors in organizing. So Amanda and Stuart both had great ones. Mine are somewhat overlapping, somewhat different, and I hope that leads to some interesting discussion. I think external factors matter a lot in organizing, and this is something that our coalition kept in mind a lot before we got going on our tactics. So the first one was like, why focus on public policy and why at a federal level? The fact was that we had a government at the time who was looking for ambitious projects to invest in climate change. And what we found is that when we compared agriculture to other sectors, agriculture was far behind. There was like hundreds of millions or billions of dollars in other sectors and essentially zero in ours. So we couldn't get behind that, right? Like, why leave farmers, the folks on the front lines of climate change, out of public support for the transition? So that was an important factor that we kept in mind to then organize at a federal level, because we had a supportive government, or what we thought was a supportive government. And then second, the other external factor, which is somewhat internal, I suppose, is that Farmers for Climate Solutions wasn't starting from nowhere, right? We had this great membership of organizations who have been doing decades of work on regenerative agriculture, on organic agriculture, on various types of agriculture that help to reduce emissions. And there was momentum building around those kinds of practices. So in some ways, Farmers for Climate Solutions is like standing on the shoulders of giants here, and we kind of seized an opportunity to make change. Internal factors are important too. So farmer leadership, like, I can't underestimate how important that is. Every time we meet with ministers, they say, we don't see enough farmers in our offices. We only send our farmer leaders into the offices in any government relations meetings. It's important because policymakers want to know that the policy that they're going to implement makes sense to the people that it's going to impact. So if you have farmer voices in there saying, this makes sense to us, and we think it can make sense to the folks in our community, the policymaker is going to listen much more carefully. Our message, or maybe our brand, has been very intentional. We spent a lot of time as our initial small group thinking about how we would act together. Key is that it's collaborative, which, as Amanda says, you need to make a lot of friends. You know, it's multidisciplinary as well. So while we're led by farmers, we bring in scientists and economists. So as a result, there's a sense when we bring forward ideas that it's already somewhat well-liked. Two, we're extremely realistic. So for instance, in that budget request, 300 million might sound like a lot, but we had done an analysis of the past 30 years of federal budgets to determine what would be slightly more than something we've ever seen before, but not ridiculously more so that government would just throw it out. That's the idea behind realistic. Straightforward. So you'll notice our policy proposals are not academic-y. It was like kind of a pick up the wording and pass it to your communities. Everybody could sort of understand what we were asking for. And solution-oriented. So Amanda mentioned this. This is key. It's in our name. While we spend a little bit of time talking about the problem we're trying to address, we spend most of our time being hopeful about how it's possible to do something different than the trajectory I presented earlier. Our approach, so inclusive and stepwise. So this is different than some organizing that exists, but we're quite intentional as a coalition that while we would love to see net zero in Canadian agriculture by 2050, at this stage, what we're trying to do is build momentum so that every farmer can see themselves in this somehow. So we're not striving for perfection, but we're hoping for kind of a stepwise transition. Another factor is that ag is super diverse and very regional, so we try to bring in lots of different folks from different corners of Canada. Backed by data, so I already mentioned this. I mean, storytelling, I think, is super important in organizing and making change. That's the kind of leading voice of Farmers for Climate Solutions, but we've always backed those stories up with science and economics. Finally, I'll just focus on the last one, that we're really laser focused. So I think you hear this in everything I say. We only talk about climate. There's lots of other issues that our coalition members focus on, which is amazing. We need all those different kinds of focuses across our sector. But as a coalition, we remain laser focused on climate change. So every time you hear something from us, it's just about climate. And I think that's why we're able to have some impact, is because people now come to us as one of the leading voices on climate change and agriculture in Canada. I'm going to skip this to talk about this. So what you just quickly saw is kind of the work we're doing forward, moving forward, again with Darren's leadership and the leadership of the NFU, is to chart a path to 2050. So we're bringing together a similar kind of model, farmer leaders, scientists, and economists, to be able to determine how can we change that projection to 2050. So over the next year or two, if you want to pay attention to Farmers for Climate Solutions, we'll come out with some new policy proposals and would love your feedback on that. I'm just going to move to this final piece, though, which I think is another kind of key factor in our organizing. So what we did is start small. We started with very like-minded people who were clearly very aligned with our values and our mission on climate change. But as I mentioned at the outset, there's a lot of producers in Canada who don't think the same way as we do on climate. And while we've had some success as a coalition in terms of pretty significant policy change and some field programming that we're running across Canada, there is still a majority of farmers who are not paying attention. And we think as we move forward in our work, as Amanda said, we need to get more friends. We need to and we need to build trust. We need to better understand where other folks who don't see the world in the same way we do are coming from and why, to then have kind of conversations, deliberation about where to go next. So this is this nifty thing we're doing to organize in the near future. It's actually starting in January in the prairies. We invite you to apply if you're a prairie farmer. So Alberta, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, please apply by November 28th. What the forum is that we're bringing together 36 farmers and ranchers across the prairie provinces. We chose the prairies because that's where emissions are increasing most significantly in Canadian agriculture. It's also probably the place in Canada where there's the most polarization around climate change. We're coming in with no conclusions, but we're leaving with one commitment, which is that no matter what the group tells us, we're going to advance those solutions to whoever has the power to make a decision on them. So if they advance ideas for public policy, Farmers for Climate Solutions will advance those ideas to decision makers. If they advance ideas on communications and media, we'll bring it to media, or the private sector will bring it to them. So what we did is mail out 10,000 letters to farmers across the 3 prairie provinces, inviting them to attend this thing. There are also a minority of seats available for you. If you're a prairie farmer and you didn't get an invite, you can apply online. We're using a set of criteria which includes things like what you farm, where you farm, and also, really importantly, your views on climate change. So we're hoping to get a room that's super diverse, where some folks might not even believe in the problem of climate change, to the other extreme where folks are farming to solve climate change. And through these 3 leaders that you see on the screen, 2 farmers and 1 leader in the sector, we're going to open up conversations. So essentially, in advance of the forum, we ask everybody, what are your key questions on climate change and what do you think are the biggest problems? And then together, over 3 weekend sessions, we're going to come to conclusions that these folks, we hope, will agree to. So some kind of consensus building exercise across different views on climate change and on agriculture, to then bring to whoever matters, whoever can make a decision on it. So to conclude, if you want to register, I think you can QR code that or head to our website. And again, we'll be doing this selection over the next month or so. To wrap this up, for us, what this means is that we're going beyond what's comfortable. Like it's quite frankly, it's not, I wouldn't say it's easy to run our coalition because there is sometimes some disagreement across our members on how to move forward. But it's far harder to have conversations with folks who see climate change and agriculture in a totally different light. We hope that this will be the next step of our organizing so that the recommendations that come out of this will bring more people on side. Maybe not in a perfect way, so maybe not getting us super, super close to the place we want to be, but at least getting more people involved to believe that this is important work and that we can be part of that positive change. Thank you.